Hey there, and welcome to Scary Tales. I know many of you love listening to these stories to relax or fall asleep. Before you drift off, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the videos, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps. Let's begin the terrifying stories. Story number 1. It was a little after midnight, and I was driving home from work. My town is pretty quiet, lots of woods, and not many houses or people. It was the middle of summer, warm and around 75 degrees, so I had the top down on my convertible. I was cruising along at about 50 miles per hour on a road, with a cornfield on one side and woods on the other, when suddenly I heard this loud, blood-curdling scream, a woman's scream. It was terrifying. I slammed on the brakes and listened. The woman was crying for help, her cries coming from the woods on the left side of the road. I grabbed the baton I kept in my back seat and got out of the car. "Who's out there?" I called into the darkness. "Please help me," she screamed back. I ran into the woods, pushing branches and bushes out of my way. I yelled for her to keep screaming so I could find her in the dark. Every 10 seconds or so, she would scream, "Help!" and I'd run towards the sound. But something strange started to happen. No matter how far into the woods I ran, her screams didn't seem to get any closer. They stayed the same distance away, even though I was running as fast as I could, straight towards them. "Tell me where you are," I shouted. About 5 seconds later, she screamed, "Help!" again. I stopped dead in my tracks. This was not right. I felt like I was being led into a trap. A really bad feeling washed over me. I turned around and ran back towards my car. I could see the flashing of my headlights through the trees. All the way back, I could still hear her screams, but they were still the same distance away, as if she was following me. It was creepy. I jumped in my car and sped off, totally freaked out. I called 911 to report what happened, just in case they wanted to check it out. I didn't want to stick around. I told a few friends and family about the weird encounter, and then I tried to put it behind me. A week later, I was watching the news, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. They had found the body of a woman in her 30s in the woods. The report said there were no signs of foul play, which was weird enough. But the location they described was the same general area where I had heard the screams. I know those woods are big, but it felt like way too much of a coincidence. It still gives me the chills when I think about it. Story number 2. It was late summer of 2011. I was almost 19 and hanging out with my best friend, who was a couple of years younger. We lived in a really rural part of southwestern Virginia, about 15 minutes from Mount Airy, North Carolina. Around there, pretty much everything closes by 10 p.m., so you had to get creative to have fun. But that was never a problem for us. That night started out pretty normal. First we went to the mall, then we drove around looking for girls, you know. Typical teenage guy stuff. When that didn't work out, we went bowling until they closed. After that, we went to Main Street a little before midnight, just walking around the back alleys, trying to act cool and edgy. We never really felt unsafe there. There wasn't much violent crime in the area. After walking around for a while, we got bored. We decided to grab a bite at Waffle House, since that was pretty much the only place open late. After we ate and made a quick stop at Walmart, we still weren't ready to go home, so we decided to drive around some of the back roads. We did this kind of thing all the time. The road we ended up on was one I'd only driven once before, and that was during the day. It wasn't far from where either of us lived. We just didn't have any reason to go down it. It started in North Carolina, but within a mile, it crossed back into Virginia and turned into a dirt road. Like most of the dirt roads around there, the county didn't really maintain it much, since it was so out of the way, and there were hardly any houses on it. The road often washed out in heavy rains, so you had to drive really slow. And since we weren't familiar with it, we were crawling along. Even though we were being careful, it just seemed like any other back road. At that time of night, the roads were practically empty, and with only a handful of houses on this particular road, we figured we wouldn't see any other cars. The road was mostly surrounded by woods and was at the bottom of a small mountain. At night, it was easy to miss any of the houses. We probably wouldn't have even noticed them if we hadn't seen a light on. We both looked and saw a man standing under his porch light. We couldn't really see what he looked like, but we could tell he was watching us. He was completely still, except for his head, which followed us as we drove by. We were both a little uneasy, but we tried not to think too much of it. We figured he was just stepping out for a cigarette or something, but there was something about the way he was just standing there, watching us, that made us uncomfortable. Nothing happened with the man, but that was just the start of the weirdness. We gradually sped up as we talked about what we'd just seen. Within a few minutes, we came to the end of the dirt road and were back on a paved road that I knew much better. We turned right, and we both felt a lot better. We could drive faster and put the creepy feeling behind us. We enjoyed the view from this road. It went along the top of a small mountain ridge and had beautiful views of the town below. After a couple of miles, we reached the end of that road and turned right again to head back towards my house. This road was a little more wooded than the one we had just been on, but I knew this road really well. I'd driven or ridden on it thousands of times. As we were driving back toward the main highway, we saw something up ahead in my headlights. Deer are a huge problem around there, so we thought it was just a deer and slowed down. But as we got closer, we realized it was much whiter than a deer. We're used to seeing the occasional albino animal, so we still thought it was just a deer. As we got even closer, we realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was definitely a person, but hunched over, with their back to us. They were walking in the left lane, against traffic, which is the right way to walk. I looked at my friend, and he asked, "What the heck are they doing walking at this time of night?" I looked back at the person and could finally see that it was an older woman with long, scraggly gray hair, wearing a white t-shirt and white pants. She still had her back to us until we were about 50 feet away. That's when she turned around, and we got our first look at her face. I don't want to say she was on drugs, but she definitely had that look. Deep eye sockets with heavy dark bags under her eyes, greasy hair, and very aged skin. I'm not sure how old she actually was, but if I had to guess, I'd say mid-40s to late 50s. But that wasn't even the worst part. She put her hands in the air and started waving them frantically and running towards us. When she did that, we could see what looked like dried blood all over the front of her shirt and pants, and she also had what looked like a big knife in one of her hands. We didn't know what she wanted, but any desire we had to be cool and edgy vanished instantly. I floored it and didn't let off the gas until we reached the highway. We were so terrified that what would normally have been a quick 5-minute drive to my house turned into a 35-minute detour, just in case that she somehow followed us. In small towns like that, you know pretty much everyone, but neither of us had ever seen this woman before, and we never saw her again. We kept an eye on the local news for any stories about a bloody woman being picked up, but we never heard anything. I still can't explain why she would be walking those back roads at almost 4 in the morning, in that condition, with blood on her clothes and a knife in her hand. It was incredibly dangerous. Fast forward to now. I live with my wife on that same peaceful road on the mountain ridge, between the two roads from that night. I drive that one road almost every day, and I still haven't seen that strange woman since. But just earlier this year, there was a huge drug and illegal fighting ring busted down the road, where we saw the man watching us. I don't know if it was the same house, or if those people were even living there back then. But after all this happened, I've often wondered if that was the same house and maybe that guy was keeping guard. As for the woman, I just hope I never run into her again. Story number 3. I was 17 and had my first girlfriend. I lived with my mom because my parents had gotten divorced when I was 11. One Friday, I asked my girlfriend out on a date, and she was excited. We both had jobs. I worked at a local grocery store, and she worked at Starbucks. We both worked day shifts and were seniors in high school. I asked her out that day because it was Friday, and we usually didn't have much homework. After work, I picked her up from her house. We went to a small restaurant about 10 minutes from my place, because that's all I could afford at the time. We ate, and then we went back to her house to hang out. By then it was dark. She complained that our date was short, and I told her I couldn't take her anywhere else that cost money. So we agreed to go for a night drive. We drove around town for a while, and then ended up on some empty roads in the woods. Eventually, the pavement ended, and we were on a dirt road. Suddenly, I had to pee really bad, and so did she. We pulled over and got out of the car. As soon as we stepped out, we smelled this awful, indescribable smell. I figured someone else had pulled over to do their business too. My girlfriend actually gagged from the smell. I told her we'd just pee quickly and then get back in the car and head back to town. There was a little flat area that was the best spot to go. We did our thing and then started walking back to the car. But on the way back, we heard a noise from our left. It sounded like a twig snapping. I was worried it was an animal, so we rushed back to the car. Before I could open my door, I heard a scream of fear or pain coming from the same direction where we had heard the twig snap. I told my girlfriend to get in the car while I went to investigate. She begged me not to go, but I wanted to make sure she was safe, so I locked the doors and went towards the sound. As I got closer, I heard the scream again. It sounded like it was coming from the same direction as the twigs snap. I suddenly lost all my courage. Instead of going further into the woods, I took out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and snapped a picture with the flash. When the flash went off, I saw a man in a white shirt with black stripes standing there with some kind of blue tarp right in front of him. He was just standing there, not moving. I didn't hesitate. I ran back to the car as fast as I could, unlocked the doors, jumped in, put the car in drive, and floored it. My girlfriend kept asking me what happened. She could tell I was terrified. I told her I'd explain later. We drove back to the less isolated part of town, and then went back to her house. We went into her room, and that's when I told her what I saw the man with the blue tarp just standing there. I showed her the picture, and she was just as freaked out as I was. She let me spend the night because we were both so scared. It was a Friday, so we didn't have work or school the next day. That was by far the scariest moment of my life. We're not together anymore. I'm 23 now and she's 22. But we're still best friends. Story number 4. I was driving from Brooklyn to Vermont to spend a snowboarding weekend at my friend John's cabin. I had 2 cars at the time, a 2013 BMW 3 Series and a 2006 Ford F-150. That night, I was driving the truck, since I had all my snowboarding gear in the back. I was about 45 minutes away from John's cabin. It was late, around 1 a.m., pitch black, and snowing. There were hardly any other cars on the road, and to make things worse, my truck, which had been giving me problems for weeks, started to overheat. The temperature gauge shot right into the red zone. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road to let the engine cool down. After a while, I cautiously got back on the road, but even driving slowly, the temperature gauge went right back into the red. I had to pull over again and turn off the engine. I popped the hood and tried to figure out what was wrong, but in the dark and the snow, I couldn't see a thing. I needed to call John, but the cell phone reception with T-Mobile was non-existent up there. I felt completely stranded. I got back in the truck to at least sit in the warmth while it idled. It seemed okay idling, so I tried driving again, but the same thing happened. I had to pull over again. After about 10 minutes, I finally saw headlights in the distance. I turned on my hazard lights, opened my door, and waved my arms like crazy. The car, a little Toyota, stopped. The guy rolled down his window, and I thanked him for stopping. I explained that my truck was overheating and I was stuck. He asked if I was alone. I hesitated for a second, then said, yes. He reached for his cell phone and handed it to me. He must have been a local because he actually had service. I called John and told him what happened. He told me to call a specific towing company nearby and that he would come pick me up after that. I gave him my exact location. Then I called the towing company. The guy in the Toyota watched me the whole time I was on the phone. I tried not to look back at him. After the calls, I gave the guy back his phone and thanked him. He just said, "You're welcome," rolled up his window, and drove off into the dark. I watched his taillights disappear over a hill. I got back into my truck and waited. It was so dark, I couldn't see anything outside the windows. I played games on my phone for about 20 minutes until I heard a bang on my passenger side window. I jumped out of my skin. I couldn't see the person clearly. It was too dark. I heard a man's voice yelling at me to open the door, saying he was freezing and needed help. He was trying to open the door himself, but luckily, it was locked. I shined my flashlight at the window, but it barely helped. I could just make out someone in a big black coat with a hood over his head. "What's wrong?" I yelled. The man said he was lost and stranded and needed to get out of the cold. I didn't trust him at all. I was trying to think of what to ask him to prove he wasn't dangerous when he started trying even harder to open the door, pounding on the glass, still screaming for help. In a panic, I put the truck in drive. He realized what I was doing and started pounding even harder on the window. I drove onto the road, even though I knew I was probably damaging the engine, but I didn't care. As I came over a hill, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. I saw the reflection of taillights approaching me. And then I realized it was the same Toyota from before, the one the guy was driving. I slowed down and looked to see if he was in the car, but it looked empty. Then I looked behind the car and saw footprints in the snow, lit up by my taillights. It was the same guy who was just banging on my window. He had been trying to trick me. I kept driving, knowing I was messing up my engine, but I didn't care. A few minutes later, I saw headlights coming from the other direction. It was the tow truck. I flashed my lights and he pulled over. I told him what happened. He joked that he got there just in time. Then he asked if the guy had a gun or anything. I told him I couldn't see. He said, "Well, then we better do this quick." It took him about 15 minutes to hook up my truck. The Toyota never passed us. He could have turned around and gone the other way. I used the tow truck driver's phone to call John again and told him to meet us at the body shop. We still went snowboarding that weekend, and the body shop fixed my truck. I sold that truck a few weeks later. I'm so glad I didn't open the door or lower the window for that guy. I could have been in serious trouble. Thanks for listening. Goodbye, and have a restful sleep.